The morning mist clung to the Virginia countryside like a shroud, but it could not mask the metallic scent of death that already hung heavy in the air. Colonel James Morrison of the 2nd Corps pressed his field glasses to his eyes, scanning the Confederate earthworks that stretched before him like the jagged teeth of some monstrous beast. It was June 3rd, 1864, and the Battle of Cold Harbor was about to begin in earnest. Morrison had seen his share of carnage during this seemingly endless war between the states. Gettysburg had been brutal, the Wilderness a nightmare of smoke and flame, but something about this morning felt different. Perhaps it was the way Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant had delivered his orders the night before. His jaw set with that familiar determination that had earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. Or perhaps it was the silence that had fallen over the Union camps as 21st century warfare prepared to
meet 19th century fortifications
in the most devastating combination imaginable. "Sir," whispered Private Thomas Whitfield, his young face pale beneath the grime of 3 days' fighting. "The boys are writing their names on pieces of paper, pinning them to their uniforms." Morrison nodded grimly. He had seen this ritual before. Major assaults, soldiers preparing to be identified after death, knowing full well that many would not see another sunset. The Confederate positions before them were a masterwork of military engineering. General Robert Edward Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had spent 3 days constructing an intricate system of trenches, earthworks, and abattis that stretched for 7 miles across the Cold Harbor front. Behind those fortifications waited battle-hardened veterans who had learned to make every shot count in their desperate fight for survival. As referenced in Bruce Catan's comprehensive work, A Stillness at Appomattox, the morning of June 3rd represented the culmination of Grant's overland campaign, a relentless push southward that had already cost the Union Army tens of thousands of casualties. Morrison's regiment, part of General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps, had been positioned on the left flank of what would become known as one of the bloodiest single-day assaults in American military history. The men around him represented the flower of northern manhood, farmers from Ohio, factory workers from Pennsylvania, immigrants seeking to prove their loyalty to their adopted homeland. They had marched hundreds of miles, fought in a dozen battles, and now they prepared to charge across open ground against prepared positions that bristled with artillery and seasoned marksmen. The colonel checked his pocket watch. 5:30 in the morning. In moments, the artillery barrage would begin, followed by the infantry assault that Grant hoped would finally break Lee's army and end this war that had already consumed over 500,000 American lives. Morrison thought of his wife Sarah, waiting in their small home in Massachusetts, of the letter he had written but not sent, explaining why he believed this war was worth fighting despite its terrible cost. A bugle sounded in the distance, its clear notes cutting through the morning air like a knife. Then another and another, until the entire Union line erupted in a cacophony of brass and drums. The artillery opened with a thunderous roar that shook the earth and rattled the teeth of every man within miles. The Battle of Cold Harbor had begun, and before this day was done, would expose the brutal reality of 19th century warfare in ways that would haunt both armies for generations to come. The Union artillery barrage lasted exactly 30 minutes. Its thunderous voice, speaking in tongues of fire and iron across the Virginia landscape. Colonel Morrison watched through the acrid smoke as shells burst against the Confederate earthworks, sending fountains of dirt and debris skyward. But even as the bombardment raged, he could see that the enemy fortifications remained largely intact. General Lee's engineers had done their work well. At precisely 6 o'clock, the guns fell silent. In the eerie quiet that followed, Morrison could hear the sergeants shouting orders, the metallic click of bayonets being fixed, and the whispered prayers of men about to face eternity. General Hancock himself appeared through the smoke, his uniform immaculate despite 3 days of fighting, his presence alone worth 1,000 reinforcements to the men who would soon follow him into battle. "Gentlemen," Hancock called out, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks, "today we finish what we started at the Wilderness. Today we prove that free men fighting for a just cause cannot be stopped by any earthwork or any army. Cheers. That arose from 20,000 throats seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The assault began at precisely Morrison's regiment advanced in the first wave, part of a massive human tide that stretched for miles along the cold harbor front. They moved forward at the quick step, their rifles at the ready, their battle flags snapping in the morning breeze. For the first 100 yards, the advance proceeded almost unopened. The Confederate line remained ominously silent. Then the world exploded. The Confederate defenders had waited until the Union forces were well within effective range before opening fire. The sound was unlike anything Morrison had ever experienced, not the scattered popping of skirmisher fire, but a continuous, deafening roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. Musket balls filled the air like deadly rain, while canister shot from hidden artillery pieces swept through the Union ranks like a giant scythe. Men began falling all around Morrison. Private Whitfield, who had been at his elbow just moments before, suddenly stumbled and fell forward, clutching his chest. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a veteran of Antietam and Gettysburg, spun around as a musket ball took him in the shoulder, then grimly continued forward. The carefully ordered lines began to waver and break as officers fell and units became separated in the smoke and chaos. Captain William Stevens, commanding Company B, tried to rally his men with the regimental colors held high above his head. "Follow me, boys," he shouted, but his words were lost in the tremendous din of battle. A moment later, he too was down, the bullet-torn flag falling across his still form. Morrison found himself running now, no longer thinking of tactics or objectives, driven forward by pure momentum and the desperate need to close with the enemy. Before his regiment was completely destroyed, around him, other survivors pressed on with the same grim determination. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. The Confederate earthworks loomed before them, manned by gray-clad soldiers who worked their rifles with mechanical precision. Morrison could see their faces now, young and old, grim with determination, many of them bearing the gaunt look of men who had been fighting and marching on short rations for months. These were Lee's veterans, the Army of Northern Virginia, and they knew exactly how to make attacking infantry pay the highest possible price for every yard of ground. As Morrison's depleted regiment reached within 50 yards of the enemy lines, the Confederate fire reached a crescendo that defied description. Entire companies seemed to melt away in seconds. The ground was carpeted with blue-clad bodies, some still moving, others lying perfectly still in the awkward poses of violent death, and still the survivors pressed forward, driven by courage, duty, and the terrible momentum of battle itself. The space between the Union starting point and the Confederate earthworks had become a charnel house. Colonel Morrison stumbled over the bodies of his own men as he pressed forward, his sword still raised. Though only a handful of soldiers remained with him from what had been a full regiment just minutes before. The morning sun, now fully risen, cast long shadows across a landscape transformed into something from the depths of hell itself. Captain John Mitchell of the 4th Virginia Infantry watched the Union assault from behind the Confederate breastworks with a mixture of professional admiration and human horror. The Yankees kept coming despite losses that would have broken most armies. Mitchell had fought at first Manassas, 7 Days, 2nd Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. But he had never seen anything quite like this sustained assault against prepared positions. "Keep firing, boys!" Mitchell shouted to his men, though his voice was barely audible above the tremendous roar of musketry. His company had been issued 60 rounds per man that morning, an almost unheard of abundance in Lee's usually supply-starved army. They were making every cartridge count, firing in disciplined volleys that swept the advancing Union lines. Like a deadly broom, Private Samuel Henderson, barely 18 years old and fighting in his first major battle, worked his rifle with the mechanical precision that had been drilled into him during months of training. Load, aim, fire, reload. The sequence had become as natural as breathing. But even as he followed orders, Henderson could not help but feel a growing sense of revulsion at the slaughter taking place before his eyes. The Union assault had now been underway for over an hour, yet still the blue-clad soldiers came forward. Wave after wave had been broken against the Confederate earthworks, but Grant's determination seemed inexhaustible. Fresh regiments appeared through the smoke to replace those that had been decimated, their officers leading them forward with the same courage and the same inevitable results. According to military historian Douglas Southall, Freeman's detailed account in Lee's Lieutenants, the Confederate defenders were witnessing what would later be recognized as one of the most futile and costly attacks in the history of American warfare. General Francis Channing Barlow, commanding the 1st Division of Hancock's 2nd Corps, had personally led 3 separate charges against the Confederate center. His horse had been shot from under him during the second assault, and he now advanced. On foot, his uniform torn and bloodied, his sword reflecting the morning sun as he called upon his men to follow him once more into the maelstrom. The ground between the lines had become so thick with casualties that advancing troops had to step over and around the bodies of their fallen comrades. Many of the wounded called out for water, for medical attention, for their mothers, but the battle was too fierce and too close for any organized relief effort. The living could only press forward and leave the wounded to whatever mercy fate might provide. Morrison finally reached a point just 20 yards from the Confederate earthworks when a musket ball shattered his left arm. The impact spun him around and sent his sword flying, but somehow he remained on his feet. Looking back, he could see that his regiment had virtually ceased to exist as an organized unit. Here and there, individual soldiers or small groups continued to fire and advance. But the cohesive force that had begun the attack was gone. A young Confederate officer, probably no more than 22 years old, appeared on the parapet above Morrison with a pistol in his hand. For a moment, their eyes met across the smoke and chaos of battle. The Southern officer's face showed no hatred, only a kind of weary sadness that seemed far too old for his years. "Surrender, Colonel," the young man called out. "You've done enough for one day." Morrison looked around at what remained of his command. Private Whitfield lay motionless 30 yards behind him. Sergeant O'Brien was crawling toward the rear, leaving a trail of blood in the Virginia soil. Captain Stevens would never again lead Company B into battle. Of the nearly 800 men who had advanced with him that morning, Morrison could count fewer than 50 who were still on their feet and capable of fighting. The brutal mathematics of 19th century warfare had spoken with unmistakable clarity. The age of massed infantry charges against prepared positions was coming to an end, though it would take this terrible morning at Cold Harbor to make that lesson clear to both armies. By 9 o'clock that morning, the futility of further assault had become apparent even to the most determined Union commanders. General Grant, observing the battle from a position near the Bethesda Church, received report after report of staggering casualties with no corresponding gains. The Confederate earthworks remained intact, their defenders bloodied but unbroken. While the flower of the Army of the Potomac lay scattered across the Virginia countryside, Colonel Morrison found himself among a group of Union survivors who had taken shelter in a slight depression roughly halfway between the opposing lines. The wounded Confederate officer's offer of surrender had been refused, not out of defiance, but simply because retreat seemed as impossible as advance. They were trapped in what military historians would later call no man's land, subject to fire from both directions whenever they showed themselves. "How many do you count, Colonel?" asked Captain Robert Walsh, the senior surviving officer from the 61st New York. His regiment had suffered even worse than Morrison's, of 900 men who had begun the assault. Fewer than 40 remained with him in the Depression. Morrison tried to make an accurate count, but the effort was complicated by the fact that men continued to fall even as they lay wounded. Confederate sharpshooters, positioned in advanced rifle pits, continued to fire at any sign of movement. "Perhaps 200 altogether," he finally replied. "From how many regiments I cannot say." The sun climbed higher, and with it came a heat that seemed to intensify the suffering of the wounded scattered across the battlefield. Men called out for water in voices that grew progressively weaker as the morning wore on. Some tried to crawl back toward their own lines, but the distance was too great and the enemy fire too accurate. Others simply lay still and waited for whatever end might come. Private Henderson, still firing from his position in the Confederate earthworks, had begun to feel physically sick from the slaughter he was witnessing. The initial excitement of battle had long since faded, replaced by a mechanical horror that seemed to numb his very soul. He had fired over 40 rounds that morning, 40 chances to take a human life, and showed no signs of running out of targets. "Henderson," Captain Mitchell called out. "Take a detail and see if you can get some of those wounded Yankees back to their lines under a flag of truce. This has gone on long enough." The suggestion of a temporary ceasefire spread along the Confederate line like wildfire. These were not vindictive men seeking to maximize enemy casualties, but soldiers who recognized that further slaughter served no military purpose. General Robert Lee himself, observing the battle from a position behind his center, had come to the same conclusion. According to Bruce Catton's historical research, it was approximately 10:30 that morning when the first white flags began to appear along various portions of the battlefield, signaling an informal truce to tend to the wounded. The sight of Confederate soldiers emerging from their earthworks to assist wounded Union soldiers created one of the most poignant scenes of the entire war. Young men who had been trying to kill each other just minutes before now worked together to carry stretchers, share water, and provide what comfort they could to the dying and wounded. Morrison, his shattered arm roughly bandaged with strips torn from his own shirt, found himself face to face with Captain Mitchell of the 4th Virginia. The two officers regarded each other with the mutual respect that combat veterans reserve for worthy opponents. "Your men fought well today, Colonel," Mitchell said quietly. "Better than well, they fought like heroes." Morrison nodded, too exhausted and emotionally drained for any lengthy response. "As did yours, Captain. As did yours." The informal truce lasted until sunset, during which time thousands of wounded soldiers were evacuated and hundreds of bodies recovered for burial. But even as this humanitarian work proceeded, both commanders were already planning their next moves. Grant, despite the devastating losses, was not prepared to abandon his campaign. Lee, though victorious, knew that his army could not sustain many more such victories without being bled white. The Battle of Cold Harbor had exposed the brutal reality of 19th century warfare with unmistakable clarity. But the war itself was far from over. As the sun set on June 3rd, 1864, the true cost of the Battle of Cold Harbor began to emerge from the haze of gunpowder smoke and human suffering. Union casualties for the single day exceeded 7,000 men killed, wounded and missing, losses that staggered even veteran commanders who had witnessed the carnage at Gettysburg and Antietam. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, fighting from prepared positions, had suffered fewer than 1,500 casualties while inflicting this devastating blow upon their opponents. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Union Army's chief medical officer, worked through the night in field hospitals that had been overwhelmed by the sheer volume of wounded men. Tents, barns, and even private homes had been converted into makeshift medical facilities, but still, there were not enough surgeons, not enough supplies, not enough space to treat all those who needed attention. "I have never seen anything like this," Dr. Letterman confided to his assistant, Dr. William Hammond, as they moved from patient to patient in what had once been a Methodist church near Cold Harbor. The pews had been removed to make room for stretchers, and the altar had been converted into an operating table. "The wounds are unlike anything we encountered earlier in the war. The defensive fire was so concentrated, so sustained, that many of the injured have multiple bullet wounds." Colonel Morrison lay on a stretcher near the back of the church, waiting his turn for surgery. His shattered left arm would eventually require amputation, though he did not yet know this. Around him lay men from dozens of different regiments, united now only by their shared suffering and their common need for medical attention. The carefully maintained unit distinctions of military life had been temporarily suspended in favor of simple human compassion. Private Samuel Henderson had been granted permission to visit the Union wounded under the continuing flag of truce. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. These were not the faceless enemies of military propaganda, but young men much like himself, farmers and clerks and students who had left their homes to fight for causes they believed in. Many would never return to those homes. The political ramifications of Cold Harbor began to reverberate through Washington almost immediately. President Abraham Lincoln, already facing a difficult re-election campaign, found himself under increased pressure from newspaper editors and congressional leaders who questioned Grant's tactics. The New York Tribune, in a scathing editorial published June 5th, declared that the butcher's bill from Cold Harbor represents a new low in military incompetence. As documented in historian James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, the political fallout from Cold Harbor would contribute significantly to Lincoln's temporary pessimism about his re-election chances during the summer of 1864. General Grant himself seemed genuinely shaken by the casualties his army had sustained. In his memoirs, written years after the war, he would describe the assault at Cold Harbor as the one attack he wished he had never ordered. The human cost had been simply too high for the minimal military gains achieved. But even as Grant questioned his tactics, he remained convinced that his overall strategy was sound. The Confederate Army, despite its tactical victory, could not sustain the losses of a prolonged campaign. Every Union soldier killed or wounded could be replaced. Every Confederate casualty brought Lee's army closer to extinction. It was a grim calculus, but Grant believed it offered the only path to Union victory and national reunification. General Lee, surveying his own lines as the wounded were evacuated, understood Grant's strategy all too well. The Army of Northern Virginia had won a brilliant tactical victory, but strategic success remained as elusive as ever. His men were tired, hungry, and increasingly demoralized by the prospect of endless fighting with no clear end in sight. Captain Mitchell of the 4th Virginia found himself writing letters to the families of Union soldiers who had died in front of his position. It seemed like the least he could do for brave men who had fallen far from home. The letters were difficult to compose. What could he say to a mother in Ohio or a wife in Pennsylvania that would provide any real comfort? The evening of June 3rd marked not just the end of one battle, but the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between the two armies. Both had been bloodied beyond anything previously experienced in the war. Both had demonstrated courage and determination that bordered on the superhuman. And both had learned lessons about the changing nature of warfare that would influence military thinking for generations to come. Days following the Battle of Cold Harbor brought an unusual period of introspection to both armies. For the first time since Grant had begun his relentless push toward Richmond, the Union Army remained stationary for an extended period, not from choice, but from sheer necessity. The losses sustained during the June 3rd assault had been so severe that entire regiments required rebuilding before any further offensive operations could be contemplated. General Winfield Scott Hancock, whose Second Corps had borne the brunt of the fighting, found himself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. How many more such assaults could his men be expected to endure? At what point did military necessity give way to simple humanity? These were not questions that West Point had prepared him to answer. "The men still trust us," Hancock confided to General Governor Warren during a private meeting on June 5th. "God knows why after what we asked them to do, but they still trust us. The question is whether we deserve that trust." Warren, whose 5th Corps had also suffered heavily during the assault, understood his colleague's anguish. Both men had been career soldiers long enough to know that casualties were an inevitable part of warfare. But Cold Harbor had crossed some invisible line between acceptable losses and senseless slaughter. The Confederate Army, despite its tactical success, faced challenges of its own. General Lee's forces were slowly being worn down by the sustained fighting of the Overland Campaign. Veteran regiments that had once numbered in the hundreds now counted their effective strength in dozens. The replacement soldiers arriving from the Deep South were often poorly trained and inadequately equipped compared to the seasoned veterans they were meant to replace. Major General John Brown Gordon, commanding a division in the Confederate 2nd Corps, observed the changing character of his army with growing concern. "We are still winning battles," he wrote to his wife in Georgia, "but each victory costs us men we cannot afford to lose." Grant understands this arithmetic better than we care to admit. The civilian population of Virginia, caught between two massive armies, suffered accordingly. Farms were stripped of livestock and crops, homes were commandeered as headquarters or hospitals, and entire communities were displaced by the fighting. Cold Harbor itself, once a quiet crossroads community, had been transformed into a landscape of earthworks graves and abandoned equipment. Miss Elizabeth Robertson, whose family farm had been overrun during the battle, later wrote in her diary, "The garden where Mother grew her roses is now a cemetery. The well where we drew our water is filled with broken muskets and cartridge boxes. This war has changed everything we knew and loved about our home." The technological lessons of Cold Harbor would eventually revolutionize military thinking, though. Their full impact would not be felt until the wars of the 20th century. The combination of rifled muskets, improved artillery, and field fortifications had made traditional infantry tactics obsolete. Military commanders on both sides were slowly beginning to understand that the era of grand cavalry charges and massed infantry assaults was coming to an end. As referenced in military historian Patty Griffith's analysis, Battle Tactics of the Civil War, the Cold Harbor engagement represented a crucial transition point between Napoleonic-era warfare and the more modern concepts of defensive fire and tactical mobility. Colonel Morrison, recovering from the amputation of his left arm, spent long hours thinking about the lessons his regiment had learned at such terrible cost. The brave men who had followed him across that deadly ground on June 3rd deserved to have their sacrifice mean something beyond mere casualty statistics. Private Henderson, still manning the Confederate earthworks, found that victory brought its own form of torment. The faces of the Union soldiers he had fired upon haunted his dreams. He had joined the Army of Northern Virginia to defend his home and family. But the reality of combat had proven far different from the romantic notions of warfare that had initially inspired his enlistment. Dr. Letterman, working tirelessly to save lives in the field hospitals, began developing new procedures for treating the complex wounds that characterized this new style of warfare. His innovations in medical care, born from the necessity of treating Cold Harbor's casualties, would eventually save thousands of lives in future conflicts. The Battle of Cold Harbor had exposed the brutal reality of 19th century warfare with unprecedented clarity. Both armies had learned that courage and determination, while essential, were no longer sufficient to guarantee success against modern defensive positions. The age of scientific warfare was beginning, though few participants understood the full implications of what they had experienced. Summer gave way to autumn. Still, the two armies faced each other across the scarred Virginia landscape. The Battle of Cold Harbor had fundamentally altered the character of the campaign. Both sides had learned harsh lessons about the futility of frontal assaults against prepared positions, leading to a new phase of warfare characterized by siege, tactics, and strategic maneuver, rather than direct confrontation. General Grant, despite his public confidence, privately struggled with the memory of June 3rd. In letters to his wife Julia, he revealed a side of his character that few of his subordinates ever witnessed. "I have seen much death in this war," he wrote in late June, "but Cold Harbor haunts me in ways that other battles do not." It was brave. Men deserved better generalship than I provided that morning. The political consequences of the battle continued to reverberate through the North. President Lincoln faced increasing pressure from congressional leaders who questioned the wisdom of continuing Grant's costly campaign. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reported to the president that recruitment had slowed significantly as word of Cold Harbor's casualties spread through northern communities. Mr. President, Stanton observed during a cabinet meeting in early July, "The mothers and wives of America are beginning to question whether this war is worth the price we are asking them to pay. Cold Harbor has become a symbol of everything they fear about this conflict." Lincoln, gaunt and careworn from 3 years of wartime leadership, understood the political reality all too well. The election of 1864 loomed ahead, and his chances for re-election seemed to diminish with each casualty report from Virginia. Yet he remained convinced that the Union cause justified whatever sacrifices might be required. Colonel Morrison, whose military career ended by the amputation of his left arm, returned to Massachusetts in late June to begin the difficult process of rebuilding his civilian life. His wife Sarah met him at the train station in Boston, and neither spoke during the long carriage ride home. What words could adequately address what he had seen and experienced during those terrible minutes at Cold Harbor? The impact of the battle extended far beyond the immediate participants. Military academies throughout Europe began studying the engagement as an example of how modern weapons technology had changed the fundamental nature of warfare. Prussian observers, including future German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, noted that traditional European military doctrine would require significant revision in light of the American experience. Private Henderson received his discharge from the Confederate Army in November 1864 after a Union artillery shell left him with permanent hearing loss. He returned to his family's small farm in rural Virginia, but found that civilian life offered little respite from the memories of war. The nightmares that had begun at Cold Harbor continued for decades, a reminder of the psychological toll that modern warfare exacted on its participants. Dr. Letterman's medical innovations, developed in response to Cold Harbor's casualties, were adopted by hospitals throughout the North and eventually influenced medical practice worldwide. His work demonstrated that even the darkest chapters of human conflict could produce advances in knowledge that benefited all humanity. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, though victorious at Cold Harbor, never fully recovered from the cumulative effects of the Overland Campaign. By autumn, General Lee's forces had been so weakened by casualties and desertion that they could no longer take offensive action. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Union, setting the stage for the final phase of the war. The battlefield at Cold Harbor itself became a place of pilgrimage in the years following the war. Veterans from both armies returned to walk the ground where so many of their comrades had fallen. They came seeking understanding, closure, or simply the opportunity to honor the memory of friends who had died far too young. Elizabeth Robertson's family eventually rebuilt their farm, though they never forgot the summer when their peaceful community had been transformed into a battlefield. In 1894, 30 years after the battle, she helped establish a memorial cemetery where Union and Confederate soldiers were buried side by side, their political differences forgotten in death. The Battle of Cold Harbor had exposed the brutal reality of 19th century warfare with unmistakable clarity, but it had also demonstrated the extraordinary courage and resilience of ordinary Americans faced with extraordinary circumstances. The lessons learned on that bloody June morning would influence military thinking for generations to come, ensuring that the sacrifice of those brave men would not be forgotten. In the end, Cold Harbor stood as both a monument to human courage and a warning about the terrible cost of war in the modern age. The brave soldiers who fought and died there, Union and Confederate alike, had helped write a new chapter in the long story of human conflict, a chapter written in blood, but also in hope for a better future.